for a couple of months, and then so we'll be up in Illinois for a few months, and then actually we'll be coming back out here because I have a wedding to go to in Montana. Is it Montana, Roger? Yes, Montana. So hello.
Oh, okay. Well, safe travels whenever you return.
Thank you. We're in an RV. We'll be in the RV, so we're feeling comfortable with not having to like stay in hotels or eat anyplace. So, hello, Greg.
Hello. Hang on, I'm just getting my tech set up. Give me 1 second. You made it bright and early. Yeah, I'm in the office. I hope you can't see the floor behind me. I've got paper
Hi,
all
Pam. Hi, Pam.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Bible study is Bible study. What's today? June 17th, 2020.
The person coughing behind me is Roger. He does not have any problems. He just coughs in the morning.
That's fine.
He coughs all the time. He has post-nasal drip.
Yep. Just grabbing my stuff, everybody. Give me 1 sec.
I'm going to actually mute myself because they're doing our lawn, and I think it's going to...
Okay. Hang on, everyone. We'll get started. Whoops. All my stuff's falling over. You go there. There you go. All right. We'll probably get a couple people trickling in shortly. Where is my Zion? Gimel. Oh, we've actually got some lawn work going on behind us too. So, Zion. There we go. Okay. Well, hi everybody.
Hi.
Here we go. Let me share my screen real quick. And the computer sound. All right. Don't look at that. Not yet. Hey, there we go. All right. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you have given us in our Savior Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
I'm going to begin with back to our kindergarten-like class of talking about the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and I picked this letter because it is one of the major letters that forms the name Isaac, who was born last week in our Bible study, and we're going to have a lot more to say about him today, the son of Abraham and Sarah. This letter, it may not look like it, but it is Hebrew's version of Z. And gets used a lot more than we do in English. Zion is what it's called. Zion is masculine. There belongs to this man, Zakar, a beard, Zakan in Hebrew. And this man is old, Zakain. And this man can look back through time, which is Zaman. And he remembers, Zaker, everything. With Zion, there is memory. There is also light, which shines from one end of the universe to the other, Zohar, the book of light, the volumes of splendor. Many believe light has been forever lost, but this is not so. It is only because we ignore the sacred vessel of light, memory. And in Zion, there is seed, Zerah, the seed a man remembers to plant for the future. Remember, you are a seed which has been sown for yet another future. That's just a little bit this time, but Z and Itzak has a sound. It evokes this sound, almost a guttural sound that comes out of your mouth, and that again, Isaac means laughter. Itzak, Itzak. So last week we talked about the problem or the troubling story of Sodom and Gomorrah and tried to reclaim a little bit of what happened there that is often misinterpreted and used against particularly LGBT community. We also talked about an aftermath which is really peculiar, where Lot's daughters seduced him in order to continue the bloodline. And I'm going to pause and come back to that in a second. And then, of course, Sarah's child is born, Itzak, or Isaac. Isn't there, is the musician, is he a violinist, Itzak Perlman?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's violinist, right?
Yep.
So there's his good Hebrew pronunciation, Itzak. And then at the same time, we do have the dilemma of Hagar with Ishmael, Abraham's first child, and they end up leaving, but God promises to protect them and keep watch of them, and that Ishmael will have a line, a delineation. One thing that Chris and I had a great conversation yesterday, just as she was catching up to Bible study, and I'm so glad you made it. I know it's early there. But feel free to chime in too, but I just want to set the stage, which was we were kind of going around in circles a bit last week about the peculiarity of Lot's daughters seducing him. And it's a good point to remember that, you know, you can't underscore too much that we're post-Enlightenment people. In other words, post-science, 21st century. And these things, such as not even cousins, but what seems like what we would call incest, daughters and sisters, half-sisters, Sarah is Abraham's half-sister, that a lot of this in antiquity was part of just how you survived and how you kept a bloodline going. Whereas today, you know, it's criminal. And that sometimes you have to kind of check yourselves and remember that we're talking about antiquity here, and in many cases, ancient antiquity, and that some of these practices, of course, are no longer, you know, given to norms today. Chris, did you want to say any bit more of that, or is that?
Yeah, well, I think just the whole point that, you know, Abraham and Sarah were called by God to, like, you know, pretty big parts in the world, and yet they were brothers and sister. I mean, now, granted, half brother and sister, but still in today's world, right?
Yeah.
That would be frowned upon.
Right.
And yet they were chosen. So I think you have to just really accept the fact that it's one of those places in the Bible where you have to say, well, it was just a different time and place. And
Sure.
all the way back to Adam and Eve. It was a different time and place. And we can't put our rules and knowledge, really knowledge, right?
Right.
On the world. So.
And what you're saying about chosen is key too, because, you know, at no point so far has God shamed or judged or punished Abraham for marrying his half-sister, or Lot's daughters for seducing the father. You know, that's, you see there, it's not like it's a biblical thing where it's just a punishment or just a wrong. It's not, comes back to, and this is going to come up a lot today, we're asking questions that the writers are not asking.
Right, or just the whole thing with Abraham, you know, giving Sarah to all of the people he gives her to, you know?
Right.
I mean, and he gets riches for that. I mean, if you think about it, that should just really make us furious.
Yeah, today.
And yet we just bypass that as, well, okay, it's in the Bible, so it's okay.
Right.
We don't really question it at all.
Right.
Because nobody tells us to question it, right? Because it's Abraham.
Yeah, right. exactly.
So, the other thing that I think somebody asked, why did Lot's wife turn to salt?
Oh,
And so I tried to do a little investigation last night about whether there was any correspondence between salt and sulfur, because that's what was raining down on um, Sodom. And it was kind of interesting because it went to a very, what I would consider, strange place quickly when I was Googling, and brought me to like the occult and stuff like that. So I stopped because I'm not into that kind of stuff. So, but one of the things that I found interesting was that that whole thing around sulfur raining down on Sodom and Gomorrah is where fire and brimstone comes from in the Jewish tradition, and so that's where you get the whole concept of the ministers talking with fire and brimstone, and it kind of goes back to that. The other thing that I found really interesting is I found a Jewish rabbi who had taken what had fallen on Sodom and Gomorrah and correlated it to acid rain, and had then correlated it to us messing up the earth. I thought that was a very interesting article.
yeah, yeah.
And I thought, well, you can make the Bible do whatever you want it to do.
Yes, that's right. And many have, that's for sure.
So it was an interesting evening of looking through Google.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason this is good to point out at the top is because we're about to get into, I think, what I've billed as the most problematic story in all Scripture. I might be being a little dramatic. The crucifixion might be problematic or more troublesome, but this is, it's something to be mindful of, that, not only different times and different, different expectations, different myth making, but different agendas of storytellers. The storytellers of Genesis are not trying to uncover a scandal about daughters having sex with the father. That's not what they're interested in at all. They're interested in getting a point across that Lot's bloodline is going to continue elsewhere. They're trying to explain how a civilization was created and established. The next story we're going to read is going to make us really question what is the point the storytellers are trying to get across, because on its surface, it's not going to sit well with us as a 21st century reader, or 20th or 19th century or 18th century. It's been a problem for a long time. I have a little bit more to say about that, but I think we should read this section first, and then I have some supplemental stuff to study, and we'll just take our time with this. This is known as the Binding of Isaac, and you've most likely heard it before. And I'm going to read first, and we'll go from there. We're on chapter 22 of Genesis. Chapter 22, yep. Isaac is a young boy now. And here we go. And it happened after these things that God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. And he said, take, pray, your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac, and go forth to the land of Moriah, and offer him up as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I shall say to you. And Abraham rose early in the morning, and saddled his donkey, and took his 2 lads with him, and Isaac his son. And he split wood for the offering, and rose and went to the place that God had said to him. Let me quickly interject before you get confused. In this translation, 2 lads, it would be 2 servants. So 1 son, 2 servants. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from afar. That would be Mount Moriah. And Abraham said to his servants, sit you here with the donkey, and let me and the lad walk ahead, and let us return and worship you. and let us worship and return to you. I'm sorry. And Abraham took the wood for the offering and put it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the cleaver, and the two of them went together. And Isaac said to Abraham his father, Father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Here is the fire and the wood, but where is the sheep for the offering? And Abraham said, God will see to the sheep for the offering, my son. And the two of them went together. And they came to the place that God had said to him. And Abraham built there an altar, and laid out the wood, and bound Isaac his son, and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham reached out to his hand and took the cleaver to slaughter his son. And the Lord's messenger called out to him from the heavens and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not reach out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, and you have not held back your son, your only one, from me. And Abraham raised his eyes and saw, and look, a ram was caught in the thickets by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up as a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Yahweh Yireh, as is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord there is sight. And the Lord's messenger called out to Abraham once again from the heavens, and he said, By my own self I swear, declares the Lord, that because you have done this thing and have not held back your son, your only one, I will greatly bless you and will greatly multiply your seed as the stars in the heaven and as the sand on the shore of the sea. And your seed shall take hold of its enemy's gate, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through your seed, because you have listened to my voice. And Abraham returned to his lads, and they rose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelled in Beersheba. Let me just finish this paragraph. It really has nothing to do with what we just heard, just so we can complete the chapter. And it happened after these things that it was told to Abraham, saying, Look, Milcah too has borne sons to Nahor your brother, Uz his firstborn, and Buz his brother, and Kemuel the father of Aram, and Hesed, and Hazo, and Pildash, and Jidlaph, and Bethuel. And Bethuel begot Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abram's brother, and his concubine, whose name was Rumah. She too gave birth to Teba, and to Gaham, and to Tahash, and to Maacah. And that is the end of the chapter. Okay, let's take a breath and tell me what you're thinking or feeling, or your reactions. Or questions.
Well, I'm glad God gave in at the end, because I'd sure hate to see a man have to murder his son.
Right?
It's a very extreme test, isn't it? It's an extreme test of faith.
Mm-hmm.
I can't
And I
imagine
guess
anything.
I guess I wonder, why did God give Abraham such a test?
Yeah.
And then of course I think, what about his son, as he's going to thinks his father's going to slaughter him?
Yeah.
What does that do to the relationship between the two of them?
Yeah. Good.
And I guess if I think about, if God were to tell me that I had to sacrifice Laura, I don't know that I could do that. I don't know that I have the faith that Abraham, I know I don't have the faith that Abraham did, because there's no way. There's no way.
Yeah. Good.
Ooh.
What else? What do others think?
Are there any versions that say the son says anything to him other than asking where the lamb is?
Yeah. No, and it's a good point, Jan. It's really hard to not, it's hard to read much more into it than Isaac is very obedient into this, He only questions, he just kind of, it's like he looks at the firewood basically and just goes, Father, what about, are we sacrificing a lamb? And he doesn't really give him a straight answer. And he doesn't, there's no text that he protests or fights or kicks back. There's something very unusual about Isaac's complacency, I guess,
Mhm.
right?
Well, he trusts his father, probably. I mean, he.
Trusts his father, yeah. It's definitely adds to the kind of surreal quality of the story.
Is he always portrayed as like a teenager? Because this picture looks, I mean, he doesn't look like he's a young child.
Yeah, no, this one makes him look a little bit more like a preteen kind of,
Yeah.
slightly muscular. I didn't say exactly how old he is, did he? But it's just we just know that he's a boy. Let's see.
Because I think, I mean, it talks about, I mean, it shows Abraham's face, but it really also shows Isaac's face.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yeah, and it's weird. It's like an awakening of Isaac through no fault of his own, is getting a lesson into what kind of, I mean, you could say this, what kind of God does Israel worship? What kind of world am I in? I want to point out one thing. Well, I'll come back to that. Hang on. There is a wonderful writer, a priest. My husband is on the chat session of Facebook Live, because we're putting this on our group Facebook page. And Andrew says, was it Abraham's faith or Isaac's obedience that influenced God to intervene? Good question, Andrew. I think it's a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
One of the great kind of priests and writers in the Episcopal Church is probably somebody you've not heard of. Her name is Fleming Rutledge, no relation to my husband. And Fleming Rutledge has written about this passage, and I want to read a little bit from what she says about it in an essay she wrote called "The Strange World of Abraham." So, if you bear with me a little bit, I think she's going to acknowledge kind of the elephant in the room of, basically, we're all asking what is going on and what kind of God is this that demands this kind of punishment. She wrote, I have a friend who had been to Tibet 4 times. I am in awe of her capacity for traveling under arduous, even dangerous conditions, and laying herself open to experiences that are utterly alien to my own. I wonder if some of you don't also admire people who take such risks. And believe it or not, you and I can undertake such an adventure when we open the Bible, especially the Old Testament. I invite you to undertake this daring activity now with this passage. Of all the stories in the Bible, the one we hear now is certainly one of the most foreign of all. The whole idea of Abraham told by God to sacrifice Isaac is virtually incomprehensible to us. It seems to come to us from another world, a strange sphere that we do not understand, where a father hears God's command to kill his own son and acts as if God had every right to do such a thing. A foreign world indeed. In order to enter this apparently alien realm, we have to begin by setting aside the questions we would ordinarily ask. This gets back to a bit of what Chris and I were talking about earlier today. We are asking questions in English, but the story, so to speak, is Tibetan. We are asking how God could do such a thing, but the narrator is not interested in that question at all. We are so desperate to get the story under control that we try to explain it away as, for instance, an explanation of how human sacrifice came to an end in Canaan. We read the story as though God were called into question by it, but the person who has learned to live in the country of the Bible comes to know that we, not God, are the ones who are called into question. She goes on to talk about the promise of the blessing of Abraham. Remember last time I said the blessing, the threefold blessing of lands and descendants and covenant and blessing is always going to be under threat, now more than ever. Suddenly, without warning, this is Fleming Rutledge again, the unthinkable happens. Its very uniqueness is a cause for wonder. There has never been another story like this in the world. Many times in myth and history, people have had to make terrible sacrifices for some greater cause, but never before or since has a man been asked to kill his own child for no discernible reason whatsoever, except that God wished to test Abraham. The mind reels. What sort of God would do such a thing, we ask. But we are asking the question out of context. The whole story of Abraham, many chapters long, as we know, is designed to show that it is the same God whose promise Abraham has known, believed and obeyed from the beginning. We have to shift our attention away from the modern question, what sort of God would do this, to the central theme of Abraham's journey. If we look at the story from our own familiar standpoint, it makes no sense from any direction. Either God is a monster for ordering the death of a child, or Abraham is crazy because he is willing to kill his own son. That's a bit of what you were saying, Barb. But remember, we are in another country here, metaphorically speaking. The biblical narrator is not interested in these issues at all. The story is about a life lived in faith and hope for some 40 years with no guarantees. It is about radical trust in the future of God. And she goes on to give this other explanation, which I think is interesting. Our daughter, she's talking about herself, our daughter and her husband take their 2 children on occasional airplane trips. Remember those, everybody? It makes me very anxious to have both my grandchildren and their parents in the air at the same time. A crash would mean a total wipeout of our family future. This is what Abraham was faced with Isaac, the only legitimate child that he and Sarah would ever have. In chapter 12, Abraham was asked to cut himself off from the past. In chapter 22, he is asked to cut himself off from the future. In order to receive the full impact of the story, however, we have to probe more deeply. It isn't just his family future that is at stake here, it is the salvation of the whole world, because that is what God has promised will happen through Abraham's seed. It really does take a huge effort on our part to grasp this. Abraham has lived for decades in the conviction that God was going to use his faith to bless the entire human race for all generations to come. And now God is asking Abraham to wipe that blessing off the face of the earth. Yet even to say that Abraham is about to lose the future is not adequate. We still have to go deeper. The loss of the future means the loss of faith as well. The story takes us out of the realm of ordinary religion into a place where there is no sure footing at all. And here we stare into the abyss. We must entertain an understanding of faith that is beyond anything that we have contemplated before. Many believe that the most radical description of faith in the Bible is found in Romans, where Paul writes that Abraham believed in the God who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. The author of Hebrews says, by faith, Abraham was ready to offer up his only son. He considered that God was able to raise men even from the dead. And this is our guide to the heart of our story. I'll leave it at that. And notice she doesn't quite solve the problem for us. She just says you have to kind of step into another prism to kind of look at what we're talking about here. Because on its surface, it's painful and it's regretful. But I can't say it enough, and I've been trying to broadcast it, I guess, or telegraph it in advance of saying we often come to the Bible asking questions that the authors are not interested in. That's both the gift and the curse of reading Holy Scriptures, is that we're invited into a conversation where we don't have control over what the topic is or the points of view. We're just being invited in to listen in many ways and reflect and penetrate. But it's okay to feel troubled and wonder a little bit, and then of course get into the story and try to figure out what's going on in Abraham's head, what's going on in Isaac's head. But it is in many ways a cruel but a morality play about the limits of faith and God needing to understand what humans basically what are the limits of their faith, and are there limitations? It's very much you could pair this with the flood in the same way. I've said enough. What else do you all think? And it's okay if you're still having trouble.
I was wondering if in the Bible, I mean, where does the term leap of faith come from?
Right.
This is certainly an illustration. I don't know if it's the first one, but
Yeah. It really is.
it's to the nth degree.
To the nth degree, right.
I guess from what you just read, Greg, it gives you a different lens, or gives me a different lens to look at this story.
Yeah.
And I think, as both you and Chris have said at the beginning, I'm looking at it as this is 2020, and this was written so long ago, so I have to really almost reframe how I hear it, or how I approach it.
Yeah. Not only the setup and the parameters of the story, but the stakes of the story are different than what we can understand. I mean, this is the fate of civilization, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Say that again. Chris, you're on mute. I'm sorry. There we go. Say that again. Oh, I still can't hear you for some reason. No. That's weird. Sorry. Well, while you figure out, before I get into this, that image, I actually wanted to show you some of Fleming Rutledge. Hang on. How do I get out of my own thing? There we go. Because another piece of what we're talking about is important as Christians reading this Old Testament, right? And that is to say, this is half the story for us. We have an example in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ that in many ways adds a counterpoint, or you could say like a further complication to this kind of story of, what does God expect out of humans, and what does it mean that we're tested or feel like we're tested and all. I want to share with you just a few moments of Fleming Rutledge, who I just read from. This is her talking about Jesus in light of these same kind of things, because we're all coming to this in light of a lot of pain in our country about racism, and a lot of pain from the deaths of COVID-19. We have said many times, without being overly dramatic, that it feels a little bit like we're kind of in the flood right now in some ways, and that's fair. I want you to just see what Fleming Rutledge kind of offers up to say that basically through Christ, we're not alone in the struggle, and that God now understands a bit more, and that this helps me at least, because I realize that even the binding of Isaac and everything we're hearing is only half the story for us. So take just a couple minutes here.
Some years ago, I read a newspaper article about a man in a southern state who, after many years of intense struggle to save his beloved farm and his livelihood, had utterly failed, and he was about to lose everything. He said to the reporter, "I think God has forgotten me." I was so moved by this that I wanted to write to him. I tried to get his address from the reporter, but it never worked out. I couldn't get hold of the reporter, and I never was able to write to him. But I thought that somehow to feel that God has forgotten you is a very grievous thing. Over the years, I have read about whole peoples who feel that God has forgotten them. Recently, the people of Haiti have suffered one blow after another. culminating in being called an obscenity by the President of the United States. Many Haitians, devout Catholics and among them, devout Catholics and Anglicans among them, have wondered if God has turned his back on them. The Rohingya people of Myanmar are Muslims for the most part, but after the great hero of Myanmar, Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi, turned her back on them, they must be having those same feelings. Not even a heartfelt pleading letter from her fellow Nobel Prize winner, Bishop Tutu, could turn her heart to those defenseless people, and that situation continues. Victor Austin, I'm sure many of you know Victor, the canon theologian in the Diocese of Dallas. You may have seen or heard about or read his book called Losing Susan, which is one of the most affecting books of its kind that I've ever heard of, about losing his much-loved wife, his heart's desire, who endured 20 years of brain cancer, brain disease, before dying at age 54. And this is what Victor wrote. About a year after Susan's death, I found myself preaching on a sentence that Jesus spoke from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? The Son of God, with that simple question, plumbed the depth of my loss. Victor writes about how he was her chief caregiver all those years. It tested him to his limits, as he describes in some detail. And he wondered if he would have been able to go through with it if she had continued living and gotten even worse. He is not sure that he would have been able. And he writes this: to enter the human condition, Jesus came down from heaven, then down further. He pierced into the saddest and lowest human conditions: grief, degradation, betrayal, and torture. Then he died in the worst way possible, his unimaginable physical pain accompanied by the mental anguish of being abandoned by God. There is no darkness that a human being can descend that Jesus has not already descended. I'm continuing to quote here from Victor Austin's book. The crucifixion was a real horror scene, particularly gruesome. The gruesomeness was in part auditory, the victims screaming wildly and cursing in their despair. And in the end, Jesus himself screamed that God had abandoned him. I don't think there is anything in human religion. And parenthetically, I believe that, as Sigmund Freud wrote, religion is humanly generated out of human wishes and longings. And that's why I think Christianity is not a religion. I don't think there's anything in human religion equal to the depths of the Christian faith, which is grounded in the dereliction of Christ on the cross. It's important to remember that 2 of the 4 Gospels, as all of you know, of course, have only one saying from the cross. I do think that bears emphasis. The my God, why have you forsaken me?" saying, the cry of dereliction, is the only one in Mark and Matthew. Luke and John, of course, have different traditions with 3 sayings apiece, but Mark and Matthew apparently thought that something ultimate was being communicated in that saying, even standing alone. I read a remarkable sentence in the New Yorker magazine a few years ago, a very secular publication, of course. Now, the context is important. This article was written by the esteemed journalist and essayist Philip Gurevich. He is writing about the disclosure of photos of American soldiers amusing themselves by torturing prisoners at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. Here's the sentence that Gurevich wrote. In that context, the context of his essay about Americans torturing prisoners. He writes, the dominant symbol of Western civilization is the figure of a nearly naked man tortured to death, or more simply, the torture implement itself, the cross. But our pictures of the savage death of Jesus are the product of religious imagination and idealization. In reality, he must have been ghastly to behold. Note, as one who...
We're going to stop there. What a great voice, huh?
Yeah.
That's Virginia for you, Virginia accent. What Fleming Rutledge gets to the point of that I think I can't stress enough, and ironically, I wasn't thinking about it prepping for this Bible study, is if you can't, I'm trying to find the right words. It should be inescapable to find a connection between the binding of Isaac and the cross. Think about, remember how we were just saying, trying to figure out why Isaac is obedient, why Isaac doesn't say anything, and then fast forward to Jesus on the cross. And part of what she's talking about there is that the gospel writers they're not in agreement about how Jesus reacts to what's happening, but that the situation is actually very similar in many ways, almost not a repeat per se, but an echo. Did you get that takeaway too, or is that I might be stretching a little bit, but do you see the similarities between the Abraham sending Isaac to death and God sending Jesus to death too? Except that when it comes to Jesus, he articulates what we would say, and probably what Isaac is thinking of what kind of God is this and where is God? She uses Haiti, she uses Abu Ghraib. We can use COVID-19, we can use Black Lives Matter, and we can say we continue to just come into the cycle where we go, time out. Where is God? Where is God? Is this what creation's all about? Okay, I'm talking way too much. What do you all think?
you're not.
You're not.
Chris, your volume works too, but yeah, what do you all think?
I hadn't seen that connection, quite honestly, until you said that. So
Yeah.
I didn't connect it, and now it seems so obvious.
And I think that's where our, it's a gift of our faith. Our Christianity can use the New Testament to be another voice in a conversation with the Old Testament. And by that reckoning, I think the crucifixion and this testing of Abraham, we could one way to call it, are very much kind of together in conversation with each other in a beautiful but also really haunting way, I think.
It's a profound link, I think, for me, between Abraham and Jesus and me and us.
Right. So true. Chris, I didn't want to cut you off from earlier because I think your sound's working now. Did you have something else to say, or it's okay if we've moved on?
I think it's kind of all connected. For me, the way I have gotten through the Isaac story, and actually through deaths of people who are very close to me, is just the whole concept of, and maybe it's the way Abraham got through, is that death is releasing people to a much better place. And so maybe Abraham was in a space where that's where was the only way he could get through it. And I guess it's a question in my mind is in the olden times, is that the way people looked at death?
Right.
I mean, I think many people do now, but I don't know if they did then.
Yeah.
And I haven't ever read anything about whether people did or not. And actually, it's the way I get through the whole crucifixion and Jesus dying, is that, you know, he was released from the earthly pain and suffering and to a much better place. And that's the only way that I get through deaths of people that I'm very close to.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that, and I think it's a really big piece of the grounding of my faith, actually.
Sure.
It's a cornerstone of it. So I guess that's all I wanted to share.
Oh, no, thank you. It's very profound. And I'm just looking at this screen of faces and voices here, and I'm knowing you all. I know we've all been through this in our own ways too, where we just and we're people of faith, and yet we get pushed to our limits on Mount Moriah, basically. And who doesn't say or hasn't said, and I may have said it in the last 24 hours, God, there's got to be a better way through this. Is this really the way through? And you know, it's okay to just kind of sit with that, I think. I can't help but be the optimist and then say, you know, even the cross, which doesn't seem like things can get much worse on the cross for Jesus, it's not the whole story, because the end of it is Easter resurrection. So you know, it's the flower in the rubble that kind of peeks through, and something good is going to come out of this story of Abraham and Isaac. It's just the depths of what Fleming Rutledge said, you know, just the absolute depths that humans can get to, where just things seem hopeless. And it seems like God's testing you, you know, and yeah, Chris, I think you mentioned, what are people in antiquity thinking, you know, without science or any kind of tools like that. They're just thinking every challenge that comes before them it's got to be a test by the thing that created us, that, you know, we're clearly being punished for something we did wrong. And that's I mean it with love. It's a very childlike way, you know, it's almost like an animal behaves, you know, like a dog going, okay, what did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? What do I need? This is many ways, you know, ancient humans processing how they're, you know, what's going on with their existence. Why do we get sick? Why are there floods? You know, why do children die? Think of every horror you can think of. And yet, why am I still here? Why am I still here? You know, what is it supposed to be? Maybe there's something, maybe there's blessing expected out of me. Maybe God's got a plan for me, you know, and this is in our bones. I think it's all creatures, even if you're not a person of faith, right? It's a lot to chew on, that's for sure. Which is why we're only going to chew. Go ahead, Mary.
I was just thinking about Noah too. I mean, there actually are a lot of stories that sort of walk in this path. The story of Noah strikes me as being one of them.
Andrew has typed in, as opposed to a God that redeems the terrible things that happen. That's right. You know, when we get to these low points, we then go, okay, so where is God? Well, God is, and I'm not trying to be coy here, but or cheeky. Where is God? I got to share the screen. Hang on. Oh, so I'm losing my whole point. God is in the angel that says stop. You know, God is in the ram. That's a second way through. Here, sacrifice this ram. God is in Easter, resurrection, you know. In the last 2 weeks of the strife going on, God is in the the white fragile person who finally has a realization that, they've made a turn and understand the plight of Black Americans. That's where God operates. That's where God works. You name it. I mean, you can just go on and on with all the possibilities here. There we go. I wanted to point out one other thing, because this is all we're going to chew on today because it's so much. But Mount Moriah, I'm sorry, it's a little pixelated. This is now, this is an important place for both Islam and Judaism. It's for Judaism, it's important because this was the site where Abraham was tested, and both Abraham and Isaac survived. And so it is an area of Jerusalem. This picture is Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem. It is a picture that is, it's an area of Jerusalem that is in hot dispute. It is currently the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem right now, and that's the dome of the rock there. But that property it's sitting on is Mount Moriah, where the near sacrifice of Isaac would have happened. So it was once occupied by the Jews, and now it's occupied by a Muslim, with a lot of back and forth in between. It's a very holy place, very respected place, but it's also kind of a hotly contested place. But just so you know, I mean, it is in the heart of Jerusalem, Mount Moriah, right there. So just thought you should know that. Actually, this map is very old, but if you've ever heard of the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, where they put the pieces of paper and the prayers, the Wailing Wall is this western wall outside that borders the Jewish quarter of the old city and the Muslim quarter of the old city. When we talk of the Temple of Jerusalem, much later in history, but the temple that was destroyed, and then a second temple, and then that was destroyed in the time of the Gospels were written. That was what is now the Dome of the Rock. And this whole area was temple, was Jewish holy land. Now it's in dispute, and now it's Muslim owned. And this wall, which still remains intact from the second temple, this wall on the Jewish side is called the Wailing Wall. It's where worshiping Jews, and now, of course, tourists and everything, and pilgrims put prayers on the wall, prayers to go to God. So that it's just another underscoring how important that property, that land is, in not only myth making, but in religious history. So, well, I know we're probably finishing up a little bit early, but did anybody that didn't speak want to say anything, or have any other thoughts? Next week, we're going to pick back up the story and talk about Isaac and Rebekah as Abraham and Sarah start to exit the stage and give way to the new generation. Although with a caveat that there's not a trilogy, but a generation here of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob will be one of Isaac's sons. In the grand scheme of things, Isaac gets very little of the pie in terms of storytelling. We kind of move through Isaac fairly quickly and get to Jacob. Much of Isaac is told in the Bible as just kind of being present and reactionary and all, and much like he was portrayed kind of in this story today. Just something to know. But we're kind of nearing the end of the storytelling with respect to Abraham and Sarah. So, yeah. Any other questions from today, or just kind of final thoughts, everybody? Okay.
Thank you.
You got a lot to think about.
Yes, absolutely.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm gonna be back on for noonday prayer in about 20 minutes. Okay.
Okay.
A little sooner than that, actually. Take care, everyone.
All right. Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.